Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from media, sports, culture, nature, politics, and more. This week's topic is the future of Wisconsin small towns. Rural Wisconsin communities have seen declines in young adults in recent decades. The population shifts have been the subject of study by Randy Stoecker, a professor of community and environmental sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, with a joint appointment in the University of Wisconsin Extension Center for Community and Economic Development.
Places that are losing their young adults and consequently losing children are losing their schools, and they're losing their grocery stores, and they are losing their main streets. People are seeing communities without young adults as not sustainable.
Stoecker, who has written several books, is also known for working to help community groups of many kinds organize to achieve their goals. So maybe this the first question just to ask so I can get a little bit of background is, can you just tell me a little bit of what you do here at the UW and what you do with the extension?
My position is formally as a professor in the Department of Community and Environmental Sociology, and Extension pays for 70% of that appointment. As a consequence, 70% of my time approximately should be devoted to extension kinds of things. And to me, that is community development. And so extension's divided up into all kinds of stuff, but community development is the piece where I focus. And a lot of the work I actually do here in Madison, and then I do a variety of things around the state as well, often with small grassroots groups, with neighborhood organizations, informal kinds of people's organizations that are working on a really wide variety of stuff. But all of it is about kind of building the capacity of grassroots people to solve their own problems. So that's kind of my take on my extension work. Now, this particular project was a little unusual in that it's one of the few that actually started through extension itself rather than through a community group. And it's part of what we shorthand call the Engaging Young People team in Extension. And so it's a cross-disciplinary team in Extension that's focused on young people. And that's about as clear as its mission is. And so it can include anything that has to do with young people, young adults. And this project then happened at the time when we were in the team talking about this challenge of keeping young adults in Wisconsin. Young adults are leaving, and there is a real concern about that. And we know a lot about that. What we don't know about is whether there are exceptions to that. And so rather than spending all of our time on this thing that people call brain drain, which may or may not be an accurate way to describe it, we decided to say, well, can we find places that are actually gaining young adults rather than losing them? And so that's what actually started this project.
Nationally, there's a lot of statistics that say millennials have been moving to metropolitan areas, to cities generally, away from rural areas. Do you see that same data in Wisconsin? Does it follow that trend?
Interestingly enough, when we looked at the demographics, because the first step in this project was we had to actually see if we could find communities that were gaining young adults. And so we did the demographics. We basically looked at changes in population from 1990 to 2000 to 2010 in all 1,880 communities in Wisconsin, which included everything from Milwaukee down to the smallest town of, like 100 people or whatever it was. And one of the things that we found was one of the biggest losers of young adults actually is Milwaukee County. And that surprised us, that Milwaukee County and the communities in Milwaukee County would be losing young adults at a similar pace to many of the hardest hit rural areas in the state. And so, it is true that young adults are moving to cities, but only to some cities. And, the kinds of cities they're moving to, probably, are only represented by a few cities in Wisconsin. Eau Claire is gaining young adults. Madison, of course, is gaining young adults. And a couple other places, but it's not common that the cities are gaining either.
So why does this matter? Why does it matter to be looking at this issue? Why does it matter if small towns are losing out on young people? What's kind of the rub here?
There are two worries right now. One of the worries is that there are not enough young adults for the job market. And of course, that varies from different places. In some places, there are certainly enough. In other places, there are not. And then the other concern is that, with young adults comes children. And with children comes a sense of vitality to a place. And, places that are losing their young adults and consequently losing children are losing their schools, and they're losing their grocery stores, and they are losing their main streets. And that's one of the bigger worries, I think, is that people are seeing communities without young adults as not sustainable. Now, again, I don't know if that's true, and that's the fear.
And so you went looking for communities that were gaining in population among young adults, and you found some?
We did. We did, in fact. 15% approximately, about 280 of the communities in Wisconsin were doing what we called gaining and maintaining young adults. So we used two measures. We tried three, but the third one didn't work out for us. But the first one was a place where the absolute numbers of young adults was increasing. And so, a place that had 100 young adults in 1990 had 110, in 2000, 120. So places had to actually be increasing in the numbers of young adults. The other measure we used was places that had a higher than typical proportion of young adults in the population. So, places that where more than 22% of the population was young adults. 22% was the median in the list of communities. And so in order to get on the gaining and maintaining list, you had to be on both of those. So you had to be both gaining young adults and maintaining a larger than median proportion of young adults in the population. Now, we also tried to find places where the proportion of young adults was increasing. We don't got them in Wisconsin. A few small towns was all that we could find. We couldn't find any villages or cities where the proportion was actually increasing.
So as far as the communities that you did found, what were the commonalities that allowed them to be gaining?
It was interesting in some ways how uninteresting it was. Schools, appropriately affordable housing, a sense of community. It's like, yeah, okay, that's obvious. But they had interesting little nuances to them. Schools, for example, it wasn't just that they had good test scores, but that the schools felt like they were community spaces where parents felt like they could just walk in the school, be welcomed, the place where everybody knows your name. So a school that's small enough, where the classes are small enough, a school that hosted community events, And so it wasn't just a place to send your kids. It was also a place where you could go as an adult. So schools really as community institutions, which was kind of an interesting take on it. And then housing, everybody compared, the cost of housing in these communities to the big city, and we're looking for that lower cost housing. At the same time, in some cases, in some of these communities, they were also looking for a house with more space and a lot with more space. And so there was this mix of affordability and space. And so as people talked about looking for housing, it was actually, a little more complex than just, looking for an affordable house, but looking for the right kind of house that was also affordable. And it did vary from place to place, so we can't say that, one size fits all in terms of housing for these communities. And then this idea of a community feel. This was interesting too, because a number of people talked about, we often think about rural places as these places where, people go to be like independent and free of like controls and bureaucracies and those kinds of things. But a bunch of the parents talked about, and they literally used the phrase, it takes a village to raise a child. And they were looking for a place where there could be a kind of collective parenting where, if their kid was acting up somewhere out in the community, an adult that they knew would take care of that kid and call them out for it. I grew up in one of those towns too, man. You couldn't get away with anything because somebody would spot you and tell your parents. And they're still looking for that kind of collective idea of parenting. And, and so that this community feel was really important to them. And so then there were a couple of things that were a little less obvious. One of them is this idea of wanting outdoor spaces. Across the board, people talked about the importance of having year-round outdoor stuff. And it ranged from hunting and fishing and ATVing to cross-country skiing to being able to walk the trails in the winter to being able to be with your kids on the bicycle, to be at the pool in the community, to be out in the local park. That was interesting because, those are less expensive things for communities to do, and in some cases can be more practical strategies. And then the last one, and I think the one that has the most kind of important implications, is that really with just one exception, the exception being Hayward, which is, 2 hours from anything, people in these communities wanted to be in a small town that was near a big city. And because they wanted the kind of professional job that really you can only find in a city in any decent numbers. They wanted the entertainment of the big city, and they wanted the shopping of the big city. They didn't want necessarily to have the big box store in their small town because, of course, that would bring traffic, that would bring noise, that would bring congestion, that would bring strangers. And they were perfectly happy to drive into the city for their shopping. Even in Hayward, for crying out loud, while people didn't really commute to cities for their work, they talked about the monthly trip to Duluth for their shopping. And that was just part of the lifestyle. And so there's this interesting symbiosis between the rural and the urban that so many people referred to, and yet we really haven't talked about that at all, that small towns may actually be dependent on big cities and vice versa.
Do you think that has always existed? Or is this kind of like a new phenomenon just because people are more mobile these days with cars and such that small towns are more independent?
We've had some debate about that on the Engaging Young People team in Extension, and the research is really mixed. It seems like it may ebb and flow. It may ebb and flow a little bit according to the price of gas. It may ebb and flow a little bit according to the relative convenience of getting into the city. But right now, it's really clear. I mean, even when we did the map of where our gainers and maintainers communities were located, it's stark. You can see all the dots gathered along the freeways and in relation to the cities of kind of 39,000 and above. When you get up north, where the freeways end and where the cities end, it is almost blank. And in between those freeway arteries, you see the dots becoming obviously sparse in those places as well.
So what's this mean for those communities that are outside of those areas? What do what do they do? Are they out of luck?
It is an interesting question. And that I think is why, Hayward is such an important example, because it is like the one exception. There are a couple small towns up north where, they technically are on the gainer and maintainer list, but that's because they've gone from when you take the young adult population, they've gone from 30 young adults to 33 young adults. And that's because somebody built a couple new houses. So there is this question. And, what's interesting about Hayward is how much they have built a kind of tourism and entertainment and health culture, interestingly enough. There's a whole kind of healthy lifestyle movement up there that is parallel to the kind of, entertainment culture. And so, there's the big ATV club, and there's the big bar scene. There's also the kind of health food and silent sports scene. A lot of it has kind of bubbled up around the Birkebeiner ski race. And what has made the rest of it happen is kind of unclear. I mean, we didn't have enough time to really figure it out. The question is, are there other places that can be like that? If you think kind of around the country, like Moab, Utah, is another kind of similar place, out in the middle of nowhere, but seems to attract a young adult crowd. And, can there only be one of those per state? Maybe. And then the other question becomes, well, can you build a community without young adults? And, we certainly have examples from Florida, from Arizona, of retirement communities that may offer some lessons. But there's also this kind of question of pre-retirement adults, the folks who have settled up there for whatever reason. Is it okay to have a community where you don't have young adults and maybe you don't even have schools? Are those still viable, and what does it take to make them viable and sustainable? And we haven't really talked about that because the emphasis has been on how do we get the young adults rather than what do we do if we can't.
So I know a lot of mayors, city managers, council members, alder people in communities are probably looking at this research and they're probably wondering, hey, tell me what to do. Give me some tips. How would you respond to that?
For those places that are within 45 minutes of a larger city, it's like taking a look at the obvious things that we saw, but looking at them in a less obvious way. That old winter coat that you've been wearing for 25 years, it used to be really warm, but now it's gotten drafty. And, and you freeze when you go outside. Well, maybe it's time for a new winter coat. Look at your schools. Maybe it's time to really think carefully about your schools. One of the interesting things about nearly all of the communities within the last 10 years had passed a school referendum. A lot of them had shiny new schools or rebuilt schools. A bunch of them had added, theaters and they've become nice places. And so, you really got to think about your schools, and that means you really got to think about your teachers. And that means you really got to think about class size, because again, what people valued in these communities were places they could feel like they were welcomed and known, and their kids were known. And that meant small schools with small classrooms, or at least schools that were created to have a sense of smallness. And then to really think about housing, to really think about, well, what kind of housing can this community best provide for the kinds of young adults who will show up here? And then to find ways to provide that kind of housing. And that probably then also means a variety of housing to some extent. So you can't let the developers drive the housing. It has to be consciously planned. Then the small town sense of community. How do you build that? What are the kinds of community events that need to be organized? And of course, then you're also talking about needing to really be good at the voluntary piece of these small places with a sense of community, because that's really how you get that sense of community. You can't buy it. You have to engage people in volunteering for it. It's getting increasingly difficult to do that. And so you really need to focus on becoming really great at getting volunteers to do stuff. Then thinking about kind of just the few amenities. Don't go after the big box store. Go after the small coffee shop, and go after the nicer restaurant, because that's what a lot of people wanted. They wanted a place where I don't feel like cooking tonight, and I don't want to go to McDonald's, and I don't want to drive all the way into the city. Then, what outdoor amenities does that community have access to or can create? And of course, the biggest thing is to talk to the young adults who are there and say, okay, what do you think about the housing? What do you think about the schools? What do you think about the outdoor amenities?
I've kind of heard like two readings on when people talk about millennials or the millennial generation is like, oh, they're so different. They're changing everything. The other reading is they're different, but every generation's different, but just give them time. They're going to follow the same life journey as every other generation. So what's your reading of maybe this trend towards cities is maybe going to work back as some millennials start having families and, buying houses? You think if they will move, more of them will move to rural areas? Is that potential?
When we looked at kind of the literature and the research, it tends to ebb and flow. One thing that we did find out is most people in these communities talked about young adults. And that, and that's the other thing. We didn't just talk to young adults about themselves. We also asked them, what about young adults in general in this community? The stories people told were that, the young adults that were happiest and would be happiest in these communities were people who had partnered up and started having children. This is not a place for singles. And so, places that are trying to recruit singles, that's going to be a really hard sell. It is getting the young families with children that is a much easier recruitment task. Certainly there are bunches of young adults moving to cities as well. Both things are happening. I think the question is, A, do you really need young adults, or do you just want them? Does the community need that demographic? And there may be some reasons. There may be tax-based reasons. There may be school reasons. There may be a variety of reasons that there actually is a need. The other thing is, what can communities do with who they have? The question is, can you really influence the trends? Well, probably a little bit, and probably in certain places. You can. The interesting question to me is when you look at all our dots on the map of the gainers and maintainers, well, right next to them is a community that isn't a gainer and a maintainer that maybe could be. And those to me are the places where, it might be interesting to understand, is there anything really different in those places? But the broader trends, I don't know how much we influence the broader trends or how much the broader trends are influenced by broader causes, like the price of gas, like the economy, like the unemployment rate.
You mentioned Hayward as an interesting part of the research. Were there any other highlight things that developed more questions in your mind than maybe answered? Were there just other things that you found really intriguing in the research that you did?
There were a couple of others. Two of the communities that we studied were Onalaska and Plover. Onalaska is just north of La Crosse, and Plover is just south of Stevens Point. In both of those communities, one of the things we heard was people who were alumni of the nearby university, so UW-La Crosse and UW-Stevens Point, settling not necessarily in La Crosse or Stevens Point, but settling in the nearby community. They kind of liked the area. They decided it kind of felt like home. And for whatever reasons, decided to kind of settle near, but not in, the university town. We actually looked at a couple of other communities around the La Crosse area and decided not to study those communities. But there too heard about people settling after graduation. One of these interesting questions is, well, how wide does the university influence extend? How many people are settling how far away from the university that they graduated from? And what are the kind of recruitment potentials of those communities around the university town to be able to provide a home for those folks? So that piece was intriguing as well. And the other thing that, just kind of stood out for me was this emphasis on outdoors, and all year round outdoors, in all ages outdoors, and how we can really build that out. Imagine a whole state where all the communities have all these cool outdoors things to do and what that might look like. Because again, it's not super expensive stuff to do.
Not too long ago, there was a high-profile thing that the governor did, bought some billboards in Chicago, trying to lure some young professionals up to the state or business people up to the state. If you were to make a billboard to accomplish some of these goals of bringing people to rural areas, maybe from cities or whatever it is, what would that billboard look like for you? What kinds of things are you putting on that billboard?
I don't think I'd do a billboard, because one of the other stories we heard about the people who were moving to these places, and we heard about people who kind of grew up in these places and stayed there all their lives. We heard about and from people who had grown up, left, and then returned. And then we heard from and about people who had shown up without ever having been there before. In lots of cases, what happened is that they started to first think about their locational decisions in terms of where the work was, or in some cases, where their spouse had come from. And interestingly enough, a bunch of people moved to an extended family area, but not necessarily the same town where grandma and grandpa were. Yeah, down the road a little ways. And so what all of them ended up doing was looking at places near other places. So it was near grandma and grandpa's, or it was near the job. They weren't being drawn to a place to live generally. They were being drawn specifically to a place to live. So they'd say, all right, here's the line we're going to draw around my work. Now we're going to look at all the places here. And so then the question becomes, how do they choose a place? And they choose a place by talking to people, by learning about the places. And how do you do a billboard for that? And so the recruitment task, people don't move to Wisconsin. They don't even move to a county. Sometimes they don't even move to a village. Sometimes they move to, that little part of a village because they like that it actually has the walking trail, or they like that it's near the park. Those are the kinds of things that attract people. And maybe the thing to do is to not have the billboard, but to have lots of good information about every community so that people can start thinking about, here's the kinds of stuff I want.
I'm wondering if you feel there's something about the state of Wisconsin that is small town, that like if Wisconsin small towns withered or maybe continue to wither, that the state will be losing something, just something that's essential about what Wisconsin is?
Clearly the people that we talked to in the 12 communities we studied would absolutely agree with you, because that's why they're in those places, because they want that feeling and they want that sense. Now, is that unique to Wisconsin? Boy, I know folks in Vermont where that's exactly what they would say too. Folks in Maine who would say that. Folks in Missouri who would say that. And so I'm not sure whether it's just Wisconsin. And to some extent, I think it's still how we try to think about ourselves as a nation. People like to promote their small town roots as part of kind of the national identity. If you think about the way we talk about cities and small towns, we don't talk very kindly about cities. I mean, there are small communities where just simply because of population statistics, the murder rate is actually higher in some of those small communities than it is in lots of cities. But we talk about murder rates only in cities. And it is interesting that we're talking about the opioid crisis in small towns. That is a kind of new and different thing that is, I think, bringing this to the forefront again, as well as we think about what does it mean to have a community?
When kind of the internet was kind of taking hold, and I was watching how it was just transforming every industry, every business, everything. I thought to myself, well, this is going to be great for small towns because businesses can locate anywhere generally. But I don't know that I've seen it take off or transform in the way that maybe I thought. Do you think that's still possible? What is the role of technology? Is it going to come into play for small towns?
I was surprised that we didn't hear about this as much as I'd expected we would. Like we were primed to hear about people talking about shopping online. There was some of that, but people were equally as likely to talk about driving into the city to shop. So it wasn't the kind of central variable that we thought it might be. And we didn't hear as much, and this is also partly because we weren't in these communities, but we didn't hear as much about the broadband access issue. And again, the two huge gaps are kind of northwest and southwest Wisconsin. And Hayward was the closest we got to that. And Hayward does have broadband. And so, we didn't hear about the need for that either. And so, I can't, there's not much I can say about it except that it was not as huge a thing as we expected it to be.
You mentioned earlier that you grew up in a smaller town, a rural area. Can you tell me a little bit about your interaction with that kind of first community that you had?
Yeah, I grew up in Mukwonago, Wisconsin. It is southeast Wisconsin. Closest city is Waukesha, 20 minutes up the road, 45 minutes to an hour out of Milwaukee, depending on the traffic. They didn't get their first stoplight till after I left. And so it was really one of those places. Worked at Hill's department store when I was a teenager, whose owner was part of the volunteer fire department. And the volunteer fire department was right across the street from the department store. And semi-regular basis, his pager would go off. He'd go running across the street and he'd help drive the ambulance. They didn't have an annual 4th of July celebration. Instead, they had the annual community celebration, kind of approximately in July-ish somewhere. They had the monthly flea market in the park during the summer. They had a cool little marsh park kind of place where, we just all, like, as kids, we just take off in the morning and we come back sometime later in the day. It's just one of those places where, as a kid, you had free reign, and you knew your parents always knew where you were.
How do you think that upbringing has influenced the way that you look at community and the way that you work with communities?
The idea of people getting together to get things done. I still remember when I was a kid, we went on the family vacation for, a week, 10 days, whenever it was. It rained a lot just before we left, and apparently rained while we were gone. And our lawn got just enormously long. And the neighbors all got together, and they looked at our lawn. They said, something's got to be done with that. So they organized themselves, and it was like, it was 4 or 5 families, all got their lawnmowers, and they all mowed our lawn while we were gone. And they all took a movie. That was the old, what was it, 38 millimeter, whatever the old movie cameras were. But yeah, we still got the movies of everybody mowing our lawn. That's how people get things done. Those are the kinds of groups still I like to work with, are just groups of people who get together and organize themselves to get things done.
Talk to me a little bit about that work. I know one group that you've worked with here in Madison is a group in the hip hop community that's been trying to get more venues where they can perform in Madison, because there's been some negativity about the art form in Madison. Talk to me about some of that work and some of the more interesting projects that you've been involved in and helping small groups kind of try to make a difference in their communities.
Yeah, that has been a fascinating project, working with the Urban Community Arts Network, UCAN. And it continues to be a fascinating project. I'm continuing to work with them. And and it is a group of people. They actually got their nonprofit status. But, for all practical purposes, they don't have any staff who are paid on a regular basis to actually maintain the organization. And, they don't even have their own office. They meet in somebody else's office. They are really committed to not just hip hop, but also kind of the racial justice aspects of it and the economic development aspects of it. That this is a way for people to actually potentially, if not make a living, at least make some income. The energy that they bring, because it's they don't just sit around and complain. They do the annual hip hop award show in Madison every year. They do lots of work with the middle schools. I like to work with groups who are accomplishing things or have a chance to accomplish things. And I've worked with just a wide variety of other groups. There is a new community center in Southwest Madison on Teresa Terrace. That really was an accomplishment of 2 informal groups of people. One group of people on Teresa Terrace, and then a broader neighborhood organization that connected with them, who really saw the need for having a community space in that part of Southwest Madison, and worked tirelessly for it. And what I and my students did, which is the same as what we did for UCAN, is we do support research. It's like there are things that these groups need to know in order to really accomplish their goals. What I and the students do is we go out and provide the research support, get the data or look up the stuff they need to have looked up. And so we can add some capacity, and we can actually do what this university is meant to do and what the Wisconsin idea is meant to do, which is to use our capacity to find, create, and amplify knowledge with the people who can really do something with that knowledge.
I'm sure you've worked with organization community groups that haven't been successful as well. I mean, can you usually tell when you go into a meeting with organization if they're going to be successful or not? Or are there things that set the successful groups apart from the ones that maybe just hold meeting after meeting and don't get anywhere?
Well, yeah, then that's the kind of the thing is the groups that all they do is meet, as opposed to the groups that do. And that, I mean, is really, that becomes pretty clear pretty fast because with the first time that I sit down with a group, if the group is saying, here's what we've done, it's like, all right, that's cool. And every once in a while, then there is a group, and, this happens sometimes with neighborhood groups where they say, well, here's what we want to do. And then my role becomes working with them on taking that first leap into trying to do something. But that is the important piece in terms of my role of providing research support. I mean, there are some groups, and normally they're actually like more formal nonprofit organizations. They want some research done, but they don't really know what they do with it. And they don't really know like how it would change anything. Those I tend to more shy away from. But a group who can say, here's what we want to know, and here's why we want to know it, and here's what we'll use it for, those are the ones that I gravitate toward.
So you work with a lot of students to do a lot of this support work with community organizations. Do you have a message for the students that you work with that want to be community organizers or activists in communities, whether their communities back home or their new communities that they find? Do you have a message for them for how to do it? What do you kind of tell them?
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have a single message. I actually have a whole course. Oh,
take the class.
That's right. Yeah, that's the message. Take the class. Yeah, because I mean it. And if there is any message underneath that, it's that, this is not easy. It is more complicated than neuroscience and less certain than rocket science because you're dealing with human variables and you're dealing with constantly moving parts. And you're dealing with power. So there really is a lot to learn. The idea that a group can kind of just pull it off, well, every once in a while they can, but lots of groups fail, and then when you fail, people are less likely to want to try again. So the whole idea is to prevent failure the first time, because that will then enhance your chances for success the second time.
You wrote a book not too long ago about service learning, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about that because it's kind of related. I think everybody's probably been a part of some service learning, whether it's like through their work, they do some service things like that, helping out a community organization for a day or whatever it is. Students, it's a requirement for a lot of classes sometimes, depending on your field. Can you talk a little bit about your view on service learning and how it can be effective or not effective?
Because volunteering is good. Volunteering is great. Volunteering is what it's all about. I mean, we can't build a good society just based on what we get paid to do. We have to do it on our own time as well. And inside of higher education, the whole kind of culture of forced volunteerism, that concept just doesn't work. I mean, okay, you either volunteer or you're forced. You can't be forced to volunteer. And so all the requirements to get in your service hours, I'm just not down with it. And, this is a multi-billion-dollar university. We are supposedly producing the best and brightest and smartest and highest skilled people anywhere. And yet we think that what we should be having them do is volunteer at things that they know nothing about, aren't trained for, aren't educated for. I mean, it's just, it doesn't make any sense. And so that's why my emphasis is on not having students go play with the kids or, read books to people or whatever, but that we should be bringing our best knowledge skills to every group that we purport to serve. So, that's why all of my support work with the students involves doing research, because that's supposedly what we're good at here. When we bring our research support to groups have access not just to bodies doing volunteer work, now they have access to knowledge capacities that they didn't. And that's the way it should be.
As far as community organizing, people's association with community, so I worked in a small town, Portage, Wisconsin, not too far away, covered city government there. And, there's 9 people on their common council. And I'd say at least 50% of the races for those seats had one person running.
Right.
Several elections were determined by nobody ran for them and were determined by it's people that wrote themselves in. That's not the case of all small towns. Some small towns have vibrant common councils, but I think it was emblematic for me of people's unwillingness to be involved in things like that. Do you have a sense of concern for community groups, or are you optimistic that people want to be involved and part of communities these days and going forward?
Yeah, it's worth being concerned. Not just in terms of governance, it's worth being concerned. Like one of the communities that we studied was trying to figure out what to do for its emergency services because the volunteers that they were depending on were just not forthcoming anymore. And running it as a volunteer operation was getting increasingly difficult. And so, that is an issue. One of the other things that we heard, and that has been a point of discussion as we've talked about this research across the state, is, people say, well, why aren't these young adults getting involved? Why aren't they running for the school board? Why aren't they running for the village council? And, what we heard from the young adults is look, I get up in the morning, I get in my car, I drive to the city to work, I drive home, I try and spend some time with my kids. When do I have time to do that kind of stuff? And that doesn't mean that they didn't do anything. The kind of volunteer activities they tended to be involved in were things related to their kids. So, coaching the soccer team or doing stuff for the school play or, whatever. And so they were civically engaged, but they were civically engaged around their children's activities and around family kinds of activities. And, the question of governance is a whole other thing. It has gotten so ugly on the one hand that, who'd want it? And we have really, I think, lost our way of what governance means. To me, good governance is something that verges on the town hall model, where everybody comes together and makes the decisions collectively. Good representatives aren't people who should vote for people. Good representatives are people who should engage the constituency and facilitate the constituency to make decisions and solve problems. Imagine a village council where all of the council members went out and organized meetings of people to collectively solve problems rather than voting on policies that get won by 51% and alienate the other 49%.
So how do you do that? How do you get people to think differently about serving in government when it just looks so ugly right now?
I don't know. I really don't know. It will take some brave people who can become role models for something different. Beyond that, I don't know.
I'm looking for some hope. It was nice to meet Randy and hear about some of the work that he does. Make sure to subscribe to the Wisconsin Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play. You can also stay in the loop about the pod by visiting wispod.com and following the show on Twitter at wispodcast and on Facebook at the Wisconsin Podcast. Cheers.